Exultet Gaudio.
Welcome back to another episode of the Heart Speaks to Heart podcast, a product of Three Hearts Homestead.
Justi Gaudeat Pater tuus. Today's episode is the second part of our conversation on the homestead and the domestic church. You can find our first episode in our archive on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcasts.
You can also find us at threeheartshomestead.com for more episodes, blog posts, recipes, articles, and much more.
Concupiscit defecit anima mea in atria Domini.
What does it look like for the homestead as the domestic church to kind of intersect with the local church, with the local community, stuff like that? How can they benefit each other and really work together? Because I think there's such a forced narrative of public life being totally separate from family life, work life separate from family life, stuff like that. But I think that's a fed narrative. I don't think that's true. I think these things are all supposed to be synthesized together more than we might be willing to admit, even if I don't know what that looks like or have the words to say it. But do you have any ideas on how the church can help the homestead and how the homestead can help the local church?
It ties back in a lot to a couple of things we're already talking about, right? One of them being the whole living where you work kind of a thing. Like being very actively involved as a family on the homestead within your local church and your local community. Like if you don't have a presence there and don't make an effort to get to know people or build that community within your local church, regardless of what you're doing on the homestead, it's not going to make much difference in the broader sense, obviously, until your children get older and they have families of their own. And like there's a growth there. But in like the immediate sense in your surrounding community, it becomes a lot harder if you're never there interacting, which again is why living and working kind of in the same space and same community is a good idea. But on top of that, also back to what I was saying earlier about the domestic church, the family living on a homestead and working a homestead being a great way to learn about God in the natural world. I think there's a lot of potential there to help teach people in the community, maybe even without words, but just through experience, just through being able to see and be a part of things in the homestead. I think about things like maybe field days or classes if you're trying to do a kind of business thing with it, but even simple things like just having get-togethers at the homestead, having family meals, having parish meals, um anything that gets people to see and experience the order and presence of God in the homestead. I very firmly believe that you cannot spend any time on a well stewarded piece of land, a well stewarded homestead, and not feel God's presence in some tangible way, or not be able to see Him in some tangible way. If your heart is not just completely hardened against it. And even then, I think there's still some wiggle room there, and you'd probably still see him in some small, you just wouldn't be able to articulate what it was you were seeing. Um, but all that aside, I think there's also a very real need, especially in today's culture and society, for practicing the corporal works of mercy. And the homestead is an excellent vehicle for doing that. Specifically, the two corporal works of mercy of feeding the hungry and giving drink to the thirsty. I mean, the homestead, generally speaking, is going to be a production house for fruits and vegetables, or meat, or dairy products, or eggs, or home baked goods, or home fermented beverages like kombucha or anything of that nature. And we should be sharing those with the community, with people in need, with people just as a general rule. And I think in doing that, it allows us to interact with the church, the local church, the local community, on a level that maybe other people can't, if that makes sense. Like in a very practical way, through the surplus of our produce, showing them God's love in our own small way.
And I think it goes beyond even just like the practical sense of having like an abundance of produce, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this a lot, right? You have meal trains for families or just various circumstances where like other people within the church are taking food to either the poor or to the hungry or to each other when they go through difficult times and have children or there are losses in the family. Um, and beyond just the fact that the homestead is going to have kind of a superabundance or a surplus of food to be able to help in these ways, I think there's also something um almost intimate, something very intentional about these people who knows what kind of quality of food they're expecting, right? But I've seen so many things in this modern train of like sign up to bring so and so dinner. These are the fast food restaurants they like to eat at if you need ideas. Or, we're doing this thing over here where everyone's going to bring some food and we're going to have a community meal at the church. So and so is going to go grab so or so many boxes of donuts from Walmart or something. Not to throw Walmart under the bus, but like this idea that even in people who are trying to provide food for each other, just there's a standard that I think there is a room in the homestead for real compassion and real care, real kindness. I don't know the word I'm looking for, but I just have to believe that it means something where person A is just expecting someone to bring food to go from the nearest barbecue restaurant, and instead you have a homestead family show up with homemade bread from scratch and a meal that's got a lot more intentionality behind it, the kind of thing that took hours to prepare instead of just placing a to go order. And I think there's something, maybe it's just the message that like, hey, you are cared for in a very real familial sense of the word. Maybe that's all that's being communicated. I think there might be more to it than that, but I think homesteads are in a very unique position to, especially when it comes to charisms of food and abundance, to not just provide, but to provide lavishly,
Mm-hmm.
and to really just pour out good gifts.
Which I think ties back really well into learning about God and knowing God through homesteading, which in this case specifically would be the homestead skill of like cooking, baking, those kinds of things, right? Like God lavishes his gifts upon us in so many ways. And at some point, aside from us just showing that lavish love to others, we have a responsibility and obligation, I feel like, to give that, right? Like, we can't just sit here and be like, ah, yes, God has lavished these gifts upon me and the superabundance of things upon me. I'm going to just sit here and enjoy them and never give them to anybody else or never share them with anybody else or never let that love go any further than me.
That makes sense. I like that.
So it has to do with the sharing of it.
I think that really ties back in to kind of Wendell Berry's living where you work, or even just kind of the ownership you have over your own work,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because in the homestead, or anyone who owns a small business, they by having ownership of their business and of their product that they offer, it puts them in a position where they are actually capable of performing works of charity, right?
Mm-hmm.
When they like just to contrast that, right? Like, I know that might be a bit abstract of a concept, but like, to contrast that, I am an employee. I am not a project manager. I'm not in marketing. I don't go out and win projects for us. I'm not in accounting. I don't determine our budget. I am a design engineer. That is what I do. I design products. So if I want to go out of my way in charity to help someone, I can't do that through my work or through my business. If the person I'm trying to do it for is like a client or something, like, I can be charitable to my coworkers and I can be charitable to my boss and stuff like that, right? But I cannot use my engineering and be charitable. I can't go to OG&E and say, you know what, I'm just going to do this project for free for you. But like, if I'm a small businessman and I build websites, I could go to a religious order and say, you know what, I'll make your vocations website free of charge so people can get a hold of you. Or if you're a baker, on certain occasions, obviously you want to be wise and like stay in business, but having either affordable products below every once in a while that people can afford who might not otherwise do so, in ways that does genuinely put you at a disadvantage, or giving away food from time to time, in the homestead, giving away eggs from time to time, giving away food to your local community, like, because you have more ownership of the finished product of what you are offering, you can use that to further charity. Whereas I, as an employee, cannot do that with our clients.
Right.
I don't have the right, and in fact, if I tried to suggest that, the company would insinuate in some way that I was cheating them out of work
Shame.
to try and do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because to a degree, I don't own my work, right? My employer owns my work. And in as much as my employer owns my work, then I can't commend my work to particular virtues after a point. There's a point to which I can, but there's a point to which I can't.
Let me tell you about a new opportunity we are offering for our fans and supporters. You may know the podcast and the blog, but did you know that Three Hearts Homestead is on Locals? If you have ever wanted to engage with us online, chat with other fans of the homestead, or support us financially, this is a great way to do it. Sign up for free at threeheartshomestead.locals.com to see posts, updates, and content you won't be able to find anywhere else. A paid membership at any amount gets you access to additional perks, including the ability to write posts, see other people's comments, and access to live chat events and exclusive video content like our monthly Q&A, where we take questions directly from our supporters. Sign up now and get 1 month of free access to our exclusive content by using code word COMMUNITY for a free trial. That's threeheartshomestead.locals.com, code word COMMUNITY in all caps. Now, back to the show.
Right, and I think that's one of the beauties of homesteading as well, is that the ownership you have over the products you grow are all pretty much without exception in some way necessary for human sustenance, because generally it revolves around food, right? Like baking aside, cooking aside, if you have a garden, you're probably growing food, right? Like that's typically what you grow in a garden, is some form of edible produce that goes on your table or someone else's table. Same with livestock. If you have cattle, I mean, you're going to either have them used for beef or you're going to have dairy cows, which are also producing some kind of a foodstuff for human consumption. It's all necessarily something that has to be used and consumed by humans or recycled in some way in the homestead itself in order to fulfill its purpose. And when you have an entire lifestyle that is built around natural things that are intended, that were created to sustain humanity, it becomes so much easier to be generous with that, if that makes sense. Does it make sense? Like, in the modern world where so many of the things we produce or create are purely consumeristic or really just kind of being in a throwaway culture, it's like, well, I'll get this thing and maybe this article of clothing. I'll get this dress, I love it for 5 minutes, and in 2 weeks, I'm over it and I throw it out. Like there's something about the nature of food that, yes, you can throw it out and you can waste it. But I don't know a lot of people who don't feel guilty when they do. There's a lot more of an emotional response to the waste of things that can be produced in a homestead than there is on things that are produced in industrialized society.
There's something else I think the homestead does too, even beyond that, right? Even beyond just providing tangibles like food or higher quality materials, stuff like that. I think there's also a sense in which the homestead in its local community functions almost as like a place of refuge
Mm-hmm.
to a world that largely either cannot or doesn't think it can escape the industrialized way of living.
I would agree with that. I was actually, the last time I had a meeting with my spiritual director, we were talking about urban living versus homestead living and like being in the country, being on land,
Rural living.
rural living, yes. And just kind of the nuanced differences in how that affects or can affect our spirituality and our growth in the spiritual realm. And she was talking about how statistically it is much more likely for people that live in an urban setting to become atheist than it is for people living rurally to completely forego the idea of a God existing. And I found that fascinating that she was talking about that. And this is like a little sister that lives in a tiny convent out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by wheat fields and cornfields and all of these different
Do they
things,
have
right? Like
cattle out there?
the convent itself might, but predominantly surrounding them, it's all crop field. But it was just interesting hearing that because I see that a lot. Like, it's so easy when you're shut out from the natural world and working in it and interacting with it to lose sight of God and hope and these different things. Not that it's bad. I think there's a lot of virtue in living within a city as well. I just think that it does become much easier to fall into the trap of losing sight of God if you're not careful than it is when you live rurally.
Right. That's interesting that you would bring up the convent in relation to that. I might chew on that. Honestly, maybe I'll even write a series of blog posts about it at some point, but the idea of the Christian homestead as having something of even a monastic quality to it, or a retreat house kind of
Mm-hmm.
quality to it, I might follow up on that at some point. Kind of the idea of like the domestic church in a monastic quality associated with the homestead. I'll have to think about that one. I'll chew on that one. It's really cool that we both see that, and it's cool that your spiritual director even thought to bring that up. So you mentioned earlier cyclicity and seasonality. Um, why are cycles even important? What's like, I guess we can point at it and go, oh, that's cool. You know, we do this during this time of the year, and then we don't. And then we do that, and then we don't. And we don't just do the same thing every single day. Like, we actually have rhythm to how we do things. But, like, what's the importance of rhythm, even? Like, it feels like a weird question to even put words to, right? Because, like, I think there's something ingrained that's excited by the concept of it that
Mm-hmm.
responds positively to the idea of a rhythm to life, like even just without having much in the way of a reason to like rhythm. We even have the turn of phrase of like, yeah, it was kind of hard, I didn't know what I was doing at first, but now I'm getting into the rhythm of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that's just a colloquialism that we've kind of developed, even though as a society maybe we haven't put all that much thought into why rhythms are important to begin with. Why is that worth pursuing? What's good about that? So, do you have any thoughts on that? Like what seasonality means and why I mean, I just have to assume it's incredibly human, but it's also part of the ordered world around us in nature and whatnot. What's kind of going on there?
I don't know why it just came to mind. And I'm really terrible at actually quoting Bible verses verbatim and knowing what the exact Bible verse is. But somewhere in the Gospels, Christ says there is a time to sow and a time to reap. And I think that really plays into that sense of rhythm, that sense of seasonality in everything on the homestead. And when you really look at and break down the liturgical seasons, in a lot of ways they line up with the natural seasons. So you start with spring, right? It's a time of planting the garden. It's a time of new birth with animals and flowers blooming and trees budding and grass starting to grow again, and just all of this beautiful life springing forth after the dormancy of a cold winter. And it is also in the spring that liturgically we celebrate Easter. Obviously, you have Lent leading up to it, so there's the season of fasting and penance, and the Triduum where we celebrate the Last Supper or commemorate the Last Supper and Christ's passion and death and burial, but then his resurrection to new life. And I don't think it's an accident that that happens in the spring when we see that new birth in nature itself. And then you follow that kind of into summer, and typically in summer, that's your ordinary time. So things kind of are more, I would say, of like the bulk of the work on the homestead. You're weeding the garden, you're trying to keep pests out, you're trying to take care of animals and do all of these things and helping things grow. So things that were born in the spring, things that were planted in the spring, you are tending and caring for all throughout the summer months leading into the fall. And I feel like ordinary time is also a time of work, right?
That's interesting. I've never thought about it in like ordinary time in relationship to the summer kind of weeding and pruning and growing, maintaining and building up kind of part of the growth cycle. Granted, I don't have a huge history with either gardens or livestock. That's not where I really come from.
And from what I'm told, weeding the garden is your least favorite thing to do.
What you're told, you mean what you've seen.
That's true.
I don't hide that. But but yeah, I've never really thought about associating ordinary time with that, because isn't that so true about ordinary time, right? You look at the church and how ordinary time is kind of all of like salvation history almost, from the Acts of the Apostles to present. It's kind of the sending out. It's kind of that very Holy Spirit led.
But see, then it follows into the fall and the season of harvest as well. Because Advent doesn't start up until pretty close to the beginning of winter. So ordinary time follows not just the work, but also the harvest in the fall. So it brings all of that through until Advent, until winter, which is a season of rest and preparation on the homestead, right? In the winter, the garden is put to bed. There's typically not, unless you're doing something interesting with your breeding seasons, a lot of new birth going on. It's a lot of just preparing for the following spring and the hope of new life coming again with the warmer weather, and allowing yourself to finally rest in that season of reprieve. And isn't that what Advent is? Is a season of preparation for the coming of Christ at Christmas.
That's interesting because so even just to take a step back real quick before we really get into the whole Advent Christmas thing, because I feel like that's going to take a little bit of time to work through even. But you mentioned the harvest, and that's fascinating to me that you would group the harvest in kind of with the completion of ordinary time and keep it somewhat distinct and separate from like Advent going in, right? Because you look at the liturgical calendar and you see the Acts of the Apostles and you see the Great Commission, which is the work, is the summer's work. But then it culminates in this autumnal harvest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you get into the cold and the winter and the anticipation and the Adventy stuff. But that last feast, that last big feast, that last big Sunday of the liturgical calendar before we jump into Advent, right? What are we celebrating there? That last piece right before we get into Advent at the very end of the liturgical calendar. That's when we celebrate the anticipation of the second coming.
Mm-hmm.
That's our feast, right? The end of liturgical year, the end of time in a sense, the end of salvation history, the second coming of Christ. That's our harvest.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. I did not realize these things. Granted, I'm sure there's some date fudging going on here, right?
It's not all
I'm sure the harvest season
clean cut.
isn't. Yeah. But it's interesting to see that these cycles generally follow on top of each other.
Mm-hmm. There's enough overlap that it makes one stop and take pause and really reflect on the intentionality behind it. And I think that's why living on a homestead is so beneficial towards the spiritual life. Because it's a life that really, in so many ways, I feel is more properly oriented to how God originally intended us to live. Right? Like, obviously, it's no accident that liturgically these feasts, these seasons line up with the natural seasons. Like, there's an intentionality there, and I think the intentionality comes in a lot of ways from the fact that we were originally created to live so close to the land. And by virtue of that, in living so close to that, in such close connection with that, we would just naturally intuit liturgically these different things based on the natural seasons and be able to feel that in a much more physical way, right? Because the physical and the spiritual are not disconnected. They are very intimately intertwined because we are spiritual and physical beings. We have a body and a soul. So things have to necessarily speak to both aspects of our person in order to really penetrate us, I think.
To catch future episodes of the Heart Speaks to Heart podcast, be sure to check us out at 3heartshomestead.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Pinterest, YouTube, and more by looking for 3 Hearts Homestead. Lastly, be sure to check out our locals community at 3heartshomestead.locals.com for more exclusive content. And be sure to tune in for future conversations like this one between Maddie and I as heart speaks to heart. God bless, and have a good day. Concupiscit et defecit anima mea in atria Domini. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum.